So let's begin. The importance of the middle powers in the post-war international world order has sometimes been overlooked or underestimated. While it may appear that Russia's invasion of Ukraine brought unanimous condemnation by nations around the world, in actual fact, many emerging economies and middle powers have been much more cautious in their responses to the war. Brazil, Egypt, India, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Turkey, and other nations have responded differently to Russia's actions. What have some of the responses been? What are the economic drivers that affect their decision-making? What impact has all this had on how the great powers view the international world order? I look forward to discussing these and other questions with our speakers this afternoon. So my question first will be to Mike. In your recent article in Foreign Affairs, which we will have in the chat, the link to it in the chat for our participants, you define the international world order as, quote, nothing more than the prevailing pattern of interactions in world politics, end quote. Could you please elaborate on this definition and what is meant by terms like middle powers, and how do they overlap or differ from other groupings like the BRICS or the non-aligned movement?
Yeah, it's a great question. Great to be with you today. Figuring out what we mean by this term is important because people use different terms these days: global south, middle powers, hedging middle, hedging powers. But I think they're all sort of referring, at least in the current discussion, to roughly the same set of countries, which a lot of which you just named. I mean, I think we can understand them as countries that do not have the sum total of economic, military power, regional role, sort of strength of foreign policy to count as a great power. But nonetheless, they have some combination of emerging economic power. So some of these countries are projected to be in the top 10 world economies by 2040, 2050. Regional influence and aspirations, like a country like Turkey believes that it's a significant regional leader. And a clear standing somewhere in global politics in this roughly defined middle. They are not smaller countries. They have more economic, military, regional, diplomatic heft, and they have ambitions to have more of a voice in the international system. So again, you've named a lot of the countries. The BRICS are part of this generally. I mean, Russia aside. Countries like India, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, Nigeria, Vietnam, Turkey, these are the kind of countries that are typically thought of as middle powers.
And so how do they differ from other organizations? I mean, they're part of BRICS and they're part of the non-aligned movement. Is there anything specific that is different right now to what our understandings are of these organizations?
So I think they're different only in the sense that all the definition is doing is distinguishing this set of countries from great powers. So United States, China, Russia, and then, you could say, one of the debates you could have is, where do Japan and Germany and France fit? I mean, they're traditionally great powers. They're not thought of in the same scope as the United States and China today, but they're typically not thought of as middle powers. They're very established industrial major powers. So, but then also you've got much smaller or much less developed countries on the lower end. I mean, Bangladesh is a very large, significant growing country with actually a surprisingly large economy, but it's not typically thought of as a middle power because of the level of its industrial development, its regional ambitions, those kind of things. So all the definition really does is distinguish a set of countries that sit roughly in the middle of world politics from the standpoint of power and influence. All
right, thank you so much. And Zoe, as an economist, would you define the middle powers in the same way? And how do their groupings manifest in the economic sphere?
Yeah, thank you very much, Joanna, for the great conversation. And I guess before I start, I just wanted to say it's a great pleasure and great honor to be here with you and with friends of Network 2020, and also it's a great honor to be here with Michael as well. As I just mentioned earlier, it's always great to have a voice and a face with the name that you're familiar with from you read from a couple of places, right? And I just wanted to go echo what Michael mentioned earlier, but also provide some complementary additions, if you will. And I would agree with Michael from the perspective of the definitional issues and the overlappings in between middle powers, regional powers, and a couple of other definitions. But overall, just in general, at a very high level, I would say middle powers in many ways they are states that rank neither as great powers nor as small actors in international relations. So really, from my way of seeing middle power as a concept, really it's a definition by what it is not, right? Mm-hmm. So in many ways, there is really, from a scholarly perspective, there is no single definition or straightforward approach to conceptualize their role other than, the kind of commonly held perspective that this group of countries, they are key players in the geopolitics of their regions. They have a leadership role in their region, in their particular regions, or they have leadership role in particular issue area. And I would say, some middle powers such as Turkey, they are traditionally seen as key military and security allies of the West, whereas others such as, Canada or, as Michael mentioned, Japan, they are considered as major trade and strategic partners. And economically, I would say middle powers, they are generally those that are considered neither too big nor too small. We have a general sense of the definition or understanding of what big is, what small is. And I would also say that right now, probably the most conceptually convenient way to understand middle power is in the context or through the lens of great power competition, because middle power can really cover almost every power that is not a great power. And if we wanted to look at some interesting measurement, like how middle power or great powers are measured, I would recommend looking at the Lowy Institute. They have, they have the 2021 Asian Power Index, of which United States and other countries, before they look into the specific Asian countries, they look at United States and others as well. So that is a great place to look at, and you will realize if you look into it, countries when the way they package middle powers, it's quite interesting. Singapore is middle power. North Korea is also a middle power. So that gives you a general sense. And I would also just conclude by saying that our current era, we characterize it by great power competition. Probably it is also a moment for middle powers to shine collectively through their commitment to and promotion of multilateralism. I'm not the only person saying this. I think Michael have already made that argument as well. And the very pragmatic Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, he mentioned a couple of years ago, I believe it's 2018 Shangri-La Dialogue, he mentioned this perspective, saying that small countries like Singapore, they can do little to influence big powers, but we are not entirely without agency. And he highlighted the need to build a broader regional and international architecture for cooperation.
Great. Thank you so much. That's very interesting. So now I have a question actually for both of you, and I'll start with you, Mike. Was Russia's invasion of Ukraine the main cause of the disruption in the world order that we're currently seeing, or was it an accelerant of a process that was already underway?
Well, definitely not the main cause. And I think it's too early to tell what it's actually going to accelerate. The general trend that we've been seeing is, you can go back to assessments of the international system from the 1980s and 90s and see the discussions of the emerging multipolarity. Fareed Zakaria's book about the post-American world or the non-American future, is decades old. So this general trend toward a more multipolar situation where you have middle powers that are that have the economic ability to have a stronger voice, and they increasingly have sort of the national ambition to shape the international order, has been going on for quite some time. The rise of China is the main accelerant to that, in the sense that China was, sort of the leading emerging power that wants to reshape the international order, and provides to some degree a place where, or a partner that others can use to sort of modify the post-war American-led order. Now, that process is fragmenting a bit or slowing a bit as China's own ambitions collide with its neighbors in different ways, and others, including countries in Europe, and it's less seen as a rallying point for the global South. But this is a long-term trend. Now, the Russian invasion of Ukraine could have a couple different effects. The obvious short-term effect actually is to slow that process to a degree, in the sense of causing sort of an urgent rallying among industrial democracies in particular, with a handful of middle power sort of associated with that. But in the medium to long term, as the question sort of implies, or as you said in the introduction, a lot of these countries have not joined the economic sanctions against Russia. They've not joined the international condemnations of Russia. In some cases, like Turkey, they're taking a very kind of strange middle position of supplying Ukraine with some weapons, but also indicating some sympathy for Russia's strategic position. So the worry is that this could become an accelerant to the kind of falling apart of a more unified post-war order, into a situation where you have, as Ivo Daalder and Jim Lindsay argued in the latest Foreign Affairs, a G12 of kind of the United States and its major democratic allies, Russia, China, and some countries more associated with a more revisionist approach, and then what of middle powers who want to have relations with both, but have a very strong degree of skepticism to American demands to just adhere to the traditional norms of the order. But it's not clear that's what the outcome is going to be. So I guess the answer to your question is the Russian invasion of Ukraine will ultimately influence and push some trends that help to determine the shape of the international order, but it's not clear how that's going to play out yet.
All right, thank you. And Zoe, your thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree with Michael, and I think this is a very rare scholarly discussion, in the sense that scholars tend to disagree with each other. But I think Michael and I would agree on a couple of things. I guess I would just add that, again, it is going to be too early to tell. But one thing, at least I would argue for sure, is that in retrospect, when after the war ends, or let's say 10 years down the road, when we revisit this period of time, I think we would probably agree that this is a critical juncture in Russia's history, because it put an end to Russia's 3-decade-long integration with the global system since 1991, and probably it is going to be a critical juncture for some middle power groupings or some emerging power alliance history as well, such as BRICS. Now, the BRICS is having their summit now, and this is probably the very first time since the BRICS come together, have their annual meetings, and then have a major war going on, right? And a major BRICS leader is under sanctions, whereas the rest of the BRIC partners is kind of disagreeing with regard to what should not be put together in this year's BRICS Summit Declaration. I think we are going to have a challenging time agreeing on forging a consensus. And then I would also say that the post-World War II global order has withstood a series of challenges since the end of the Bretton Woods system, say in 1971, right? And between then and now, there are new power groupings emerged, such as, we have the rise of the OPEC, since, the energy crisis we are talking about right now, you have the OPEC, and then there were the rise of emerging market, especially India, China, the BRICS, ASEAN, among others. And a lot of these new power groups, they have demanded representations in the existing system, either through WTO, World Bank, IMF, etc. And then at the same time, the incumbent powers is not trouble-free in many ways, right? We have the United States, and we see European Union collectively. We've seen our own problems. On the one hand, we have a global financial crisis, and then there's a Eurozone crisis, and in particular, I would say global financial crisis in many ways is another critical juncture that has led China and Russia, as well as other aspiring emerging powers, to, on the one hand, come closer, and then on the other hand, present their alternative narrative, trying to convince the rest of the world, saying that, well, this is the moment of the West decline and the rise of probably the rise of the rest. It's just that we haven't seen a credible argument or credible evidence to say the rise of these emerging groups can sustain, especially given that we are talking about record high inflation and with monetary tightening here in the United States and in the European Union. Probably they are going to have some serious challenges for their long-term economic outlook and for emerging market. So I would say, overall, yes, it is a challenge to the global order, but it's not the disruptive point that lead to the fragmentation.
All right. Thank you so much. So, Mike, the invasion of Ukraine revealed much of the middle powers' skepticism toward punishing Russia, and we saw mixed reactions. Why do you think there is that skepticism from the middle powers? And how can the United States adjust its policies to retain its influence, whatever amount it has in those countries?
Yeah, and I think that influence is still, very significant. And I mean, just to be clear, I strongly believe that, broadly speaking, the U.S. influence since World War II on global politics has been, on balance, positive. But I think the United States, U.S. officials know this very well, but Americans have to keep in mind that the view throughout the world about the effects of American power is more mixed than Americans would hold. And a lot of these countries, right up through their scholarly and official and elite classes, there's a significant belief that the United States has been hypocritical in the approach to the order, that it follows the rules when it believes they serve its interests, but when they don't, when it wants to invade Iraq, when it wants to treat detainees poorly, when it wants to not join the International Criminal Court or the UN Commission on the Law of the Sea, that it does what it wants. And I think that that combined with decades of demands on these countries led by US dominated institutions like the IMF for very painful reforms. And then on top of that, I think, frankly, the most important trend in world politics, and it's important not to exaggerate this and to understand it in context, but is the sort of decay or delegitimization of what has been called the neoliberal model, the Washington Consensus. As Zoe was mentioning, a lot of the advanced industrial democracies have very significant social problems, and we're not projecting the kind of image that we were before. And there's a lot of elements of the essential neoliberal model that needs significant revision. So you stack all this up, and on top of the long-term trends toward multipolarity, and you have a situation where it is very natural that these countries are going to be skeptical of American demands, American power. And to some of them, when they look at Ukraine, they say, why is this different from Iraq? Why is this different from Vietnam? Why is this different from Libya? Why is this different from the other times when the West chose to use force? I think there are differences. I don't think it is equivalent to, say, the US intervention in Iraq. But there's a lot of reasons why in other parts of the world, there is not an automatic knee-jerk reaction that Russia's evil, the United States and Europe are good, and they have to jump on the bandwagon. And I think, just to conclude, for countries that have had, sort of a mixed feeling about the post-war order, in the sense that there's a lot of good that it has done. I mean, if you look at the general global trends on the decline of poverty and the decline of inequality between countries, even as inequality within countries has grown, this order has achieved tremendous things. But yet it has been very overbearing at times and has been accompanied by real economic and political demands directed at some of these countries. And so given a chance to rebalance the international order more in their direction, grab more of a voice, tell the United States that they don't just have to, rigidly follow what we demand, it's kind of natural that they feel that way. And to your last point there of what the United States has to do, we have to be willing to share power and influence, as Zoe was mentioning, in some of these international institutions, for example. I think it's time for the United States to come out, although I think China and Russia would never agree to this, and say we actually support a revision of the UN Security Council to open it up for more members, including members from what we're talking about as the global South or middle powers. That's always been a total non-starter in the United States, but I think the price we would pay in terms of our influence is less than the advantage we would get in being seen to be willing to open up this system to more voices. So that's the fundamental thing we have to do.
Great, thank you. And then this question is actually for both of you, and I will start with you, Zoe. Are there any positive implications or potential benefits to the current competition within the liberal world order?
I guess if I tend to be, I tend to be optimistic, and in this particular moment, I would say at least there are three reasons to be optimistic. First is that since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we do see United States and its major allies have come together firmly and very quickly. And when we look at the European Union, looking across the Atlantic, sometimes I tend to think that European Union leaders, they are not slow, but it would be surprising if they were able to get anything done within a month. But surprisingly, within 1 week of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we've seen EU leaders get together and rolled out several rounds of sanctions, and they even rolled out a roadmap for decreasing their energy dependence on Russia. The level of solidarity of European Union in many ways surprised Russia, and Putin surprised the European leaders themselves. So I think, at this critical moment, we see us and our allies standing firmly together is a very good sign. And then secondly, I would say from a very practical perspective, within the global system, people talk about, or like a buzzword most recently, before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that there was, the COP26 commitment to climate change and so on and so forth. And the commitment to climate change used to be such a politicized issue, but now with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think the general trend is going to be a accelerated transition to net zero, which is going to be a positive sign. But we can debate about to what extent the short-term challenges with German turning back is coal-fired power plant and so on and so forth, to what extent the short-term challenges are going to be, but at least in the long run, I would think the acceleration of energy transition is a good sign. And then lastly, I would say from a US leadership perspective, in many ways, we do see the United States currently is stepping up its diplomatic game in areas where it used previous administrations or in the past few decades, the United States has basically overlooked. Like, for example, we closed our embassy in the Solomon Island in the 1990s, but recently with China's growing influence in the region, we are sending our leaders to the region, and we are also inviting ASEAN leaders come over to Washington, D.C. So, we are up our game to diplomatically, economically. So in many ways, I think there are reasons to be optimistic.
Great, thank you so much. And Mike, do you see reasons, do you see benefits in the competition?
So I definitely see a benefit. I mean, I'll give you one reason why I think there's a benefit, and then one reason why I remain concerned. The benefit of the competition and the sort of accumulating evidence, part of which is always talking about that the United States has some challenges, particularly in the international realm of maintaining support for the current order and in dealing with the challenges posed by Russia and China, is that it's an opportunity for self-reflection. It's an opportunity for reform. It's a sort of a catalyst to make us think of things that we need to do differently, both domestically and internationally. So, domestically getting after the various things that are going on in our society that are sapping the strength of our engine of national dynamism, and then internationally thinking of ways we have to reformulate this order. So that's the reason, that's the opportunity that it presents. I have sort of mixed feelings about whether I think we're going to take that opportunity for different domestic and international reasons. Domestically, I think we're just so fragmented right now and so driven by disinformation in our public debates that we're not in the same place that we were in 1950, 1970, even mid 1980s in terms of having a bipartisan basis to be reflective and to come up with ideas of things we need to change. And then internationally, I worry that the overhang of the post-Cold War period of American primacy and the kind of moralistic impulse of our leadership of the international order is a roadblock to our being flexible and adaptive. And we have this accumulated mindset that we're right and we'll tell other people what to do because it's right. And, you know, look, 6 or 7 times out of 10, that might be true. But the problem is that's not the way you can lead in a more multipolar situation. So actually, I would just mention that we just, in the last couple of days, came out with a big new RAND study about the societal determinants of national competitiveness. And I think that's a theme that if we're going to be reflective, we have to put attention on what are the aspects of our society that have allowed us to have the predominant position we've had? Where do they stand and what do we have to do to renew them? So that's the dialogue. I think it would be important. And I think it's sort of a flip of the coin whether our political system is capable of that right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Yes, very interesting perspective on the societal aspect. So if I will just switch gears and ask you a question, Zoe, before I turn to the Q&A box. China and Russia are attempting to gain more financial independence and decouple from US related major financial institutions, you know, by creating their own messaging systems, for example. Given the market interdependence primarily between China and the US, and to a far lesser degree with Russia, to what extent can economic independence be achieved for them?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. You know, overall, I recently published an article with Foreign Policy talking about how China is trying to fix its economic vulnerabilities to prepare for the worst case scenario. So, just to to quickly summarize what I've covered in the article, basically I touched upon the issue of, yes, to begin with, you know, there is the issue of a dollar's supremacy in many ways, you know, having liquidity access to the dollar-based global financial system as well as the payment system. It is essential. And it's the fundamental power for allowing, in many ways, allowing the United States to effectively exercise its sanctions. But you know, China and Russia have been preparing in many ways for this moment. In particular, Russia, and yes, China has developed its own alternative system. But you know, when China first designed its own alternative payment system, the so-called cross-border payment system, is not for preparation for decoupling. Really, it was about improving the international user experience of renminbi in cross-border transfers. So, you know, but starting from 2018 with the heightening of US-China trade war, increasingly within China, there have been a lot of voices talking about the preparation for financial war. Hence, we started to realize, you know, here in the United States, we started to realize probably there is a vehicle for China to achieve financial autonomy, at least relatively speaking, by using, on the one hand, renminbi-based global payment system, and then on the other hand, enhanced by the digital renminbi. And then at the practical level, I would also, you know, highlight China's offensive capability, if you will. You know, right now we tend to in particular from the perspective of Department of Defense, we pay a lot of attention to China's naval power, citing, China has the largest navy in the world. But, if you look at their combat readiness as well as their equipment, it's really not at the same level as the United States. But what I would want to emphasize is China's influence in global commercial sea lanes, and in particular, China's control over, or China's investment, or having access, having influence over major global ports. By 2019, China has already invested in more than 100 global ports, and in Europe, in Australia, in Asia, and in Latin America, in Africa. And in many ways, in a worst case scenario, say decoupling, what China could literally do is to disruptive global supply chain by simply disrupt the global commercial sea lanes. And this does not have to be militarily. It can be as simple as, hey, somebody operating the port suddenly just did not show up at work. So if they didn't show up at work, they could not process all your container ships paperwork. Hence, whatever your perishables in the container is going to sit there and become rotten. So I would say, both from offensive capability and a defensive capability, China does have, the potential to achieve a higher level of autonomy. But it's not without any cost for China themselves, right?
Great, thank you so much. So now I'll turn to the Q&A box, and the first question is, and this could be for you, Mike, and for Zoe, but we'll start with you, Mike. Canada has had long debates about its role as a middle power. Are there differences between middle powers in the global South and the global North?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And we could have gone on the definition point at the beginning for 20 minutes. It's really important to differentiate among these countries what we're calling middle powers. South Korea is also often nominated as a middle power, and one of the most technologically advanced economies in the world. So yeah, there are differences, but I would say it's more complicated than just dividing it into global North and global South. There's just ultimately it's important to treat every country on its own terms, as if we want to nominate as a middle power. And you could ask, what are their ambitions? What capabilities do they have? Where can they contribute to elements of the order? I mean, ultimately, India is kind of part of the global middle right now, or often put that way, but India is really another emerging heavyweight. I mean, by some projections, depending on how its economy goes, it is projected to pass, as China did, pass the United States measured in purchasing power parity terms, in terms of the size of its economy by 2050, going to be one of the 3 dominant economies of the world. If you add the EU as a collective group, so that would be 4. So at that point, would India count really as a middle power anymore? We just have to treat them all differently. And absolutely, we can think of Canada differently than Brazil, Turkey, South Africa, others. But the idea is there is a group of countries with many different characteristics that collectively want a greater voice in international norm setting, rule setting, in the operation of international institutions. And I think Canada's further along in that road because of its natural advantages and capabilities than some others. But it's ultimately just important to think of countries individually as opposed to trying to force them into ideal type groups.
Okay, thank you. And then this question is for Zoe. Recognizing the influence of middle powers, U.S. firms initiated various partnership and funding models to support the expected growth. As such, is the U.S. influencing middle power movement? And moreover, should we expect the U.S. will continue to exclude the continent of Africa from moving into middle power position?
That's a great question. Thank you for raising this issue, in particular, bringing the perspective of U.S. firms. In many ways, we tend to have, when we talk about middle powers, we tend to have a state-centric perspective. But I would say, yes, indeed, from my perspective, when we look at the strength of the United States, it is our firms, it is our private sector. And, when the interesting part is, when the Biden administration have been talking about Build a Better Act and have the global have a global operation of the U.S. alternative or the Western alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative. But in many ways, a lot of what the Biden administration proposed to do, our firms have already been doing in many ways by forming partnerships, joint investment vehicles, and in the form of investment aid and other format to support other countries' growth, whether it is in Africa or elsewhere. And in many ways, China as a probably so far the most successful emerging power so far has benefited tremendously from not just the US-led global system, but also US firms. If you look at China's reform and open up, Goldman Sachs and the US economists, US firms provided a tremendous amount of support, right, and policy advices. And we've seen the end of literally a couple of weeks ago with the end of Shanghai lockdown, we've seen U.S. equity, U.S. investors investing in Chinese equity market started to bounce back, which leads to people's relatively positive evaluation of maybe China can meet its 5.5% economic growth target. But the bottom line is, I would say yes, United States, and in particular U.S. firms through their private partnership and their willingness to work with the foreign government, foreign stakeholders, foreign companies, whether it is SOEs or foreign private companies, have influenced the rise of middle powers at large.
Great, thank you so much. This next question will be, I think, for you, Mike. Can you talk about the role of Iran as a middle power and the transition in the international world order, meaning its impact, I guess, on the international world order?
So, yeah, it's a hard question to answer in the sense that Iran is obviously, by sort of its size, its historical position, its self-image and regional ambitions, has a lot of characteristics of a regional power, but it isn't typically treated in the same way as a lot of others, just because obviously the nature of the current government is such that it's not integrating with the world economy in significant ways. And its fundamental position is adversarial. So the basic way that it's exercising power is to undertake a revisionist approach and support proxy efforts and other kinds of activities, primarily in the Middle East, that are designed to increase its power relative to its main regional rivals. So in that sense, it's not sort of a global player middle power as much as a regional revisionist. And one of the really interesting questions about world politics over the next decade or so is, do you have this sort of collection of revisionists increasingly moving off into their own group? There have been reports in the last week that some Russian officials have started to go down to Iran to ask them, so how is it that you avoid international sanctions? How do you get these iPhones that we're worried we're not going to be able to get anymore? North Korea is really, even to those countries, still an outlier, but could be part of some of those discussions. And then the question is sort of, as the question was posed to Zoe, to what degree might China's future behavior lead to more of an adversarial approach by others toward China? And would China double down on its partnership with Russia and potentially others, including Iran, which is a source of, obviously China, as is typical, announced an immense investment program with Iran some time ago. And then how that's actually played out has been a little slower than the rhetoric. But the possibility of an expanded partnership is there. So to me, that's the bigger question, not so much Iran as a middle power, but Iran as a revisionist power in a sense. And what happens to those? It's very much in the interest of the United States, and I think the world community, that China be pulled back from a direction of moving more to the margins of the international order, that Iran be integrated more into the international order rather than less, which is one of the reasons that I've long believed in the value of, generally speaking, a policy of engagement as opposed to isolation with regard to countries like Iran. But their behavior will ultimately determine that, and it's too early to tell. So I think that's, to me, the most interesting way to think about Iran as a as a catalyst of where the international system goes. I just wanted to say real quickly to Zoe's last point, agree very strongly. You know, some of what you were saying, Zoe, really sort of reminded me that the dominant narrative these days, and it has a lot of reasons for support, is that the neoliberal model is dead and the post-war order is fragmenting and in need of radical revision. It's easy to forget the benefits of the post-war order and a lot of the fundamental economic trends, institutions, practices, and norms. I mean, the international economic order of the last 50 years has been the greatest anti-poverty program in the history of the human race. You have had a significant convergence of developing countries with developing countries with the developed world, so that although we're very worried about inequality within countries, the inequality between the leading industrial countries and many developing countries has declined over the last number of decades. So the critical question is not how can we throw away the existing system and replace it with something totally different, but what has worked and what hasn't. Who is not being well served by the existing order, by the existing international economic system, and what can we do to, but that discussion demands a level of nuance, you know, and having read also a number of your things, Zoe, is, you know, I love your work, and that's the kind of nuanced treatment, but that's very difficult to make a political tagline or bumper sticker, right? Throw away the existing order is easy to say. There's parts of the existing order that need some reform, and we have to make some changes around the margins, and also sometimes more, you know, I mean, now you're at a point where a politician can't make that case. So that gets back to my reason for worry, is that we need to keep what works and reform it significantly. And that takes really thoughtful leadership that is in short supply.
So really reform instead of elimination, basically, is what is your point there. Great, thank you. This question for Zoe is, what's your projection opinion regarding ASEAN countries' role as a group of middle powers in rising tensions in the Pacific between the US and China?
Yeah, that's another fantastic question. And in many ways, I think ASEAN countries have shown their resilience over the years, despite, you know, the internal differences and all that. But in many ways, I would not want to single out ASEAN group, but rather think about ASEAN in the Indo-Pacific region, and together with other major stakeholders, in particular Japan, and Australia, and South Korea, because you know, ASEAN, as important as ASEAN countries, ASEAN countries themselves are, they themselves have different degrees of dependence on China. That's just the reality. And in many ways, countries now, I mean, firms right now talk about supply chain resiliencies by embracing the China plus one or China plus X model. And several of these ASEAN countries, they benefit from this diversification. For example, Vietnam is one, and in many ways, Thailand is another example, right? But the hard reality is it takes a lot of consideration and planning, and it's logistically just difficult for firms to quickly pull out of China during a pandemic and relocate to Southeast Asia. On the one hand, is because it's simply as, you know, as moving. You know, for individuals, when you're living in a city for a long period of time, you get used to the neighborhood, you know all your suppliers, it just becomes very difficult to move. And then on the other hand, China is the only country by many measures that has that relatively complete supply chain at a relatively decent cost, despite you know, the reason rising labor costs and all that. So in many ways, it's very challenging for global companies to move to Southeast Asia. But when you look at other regional players, right, Japan, South Korea, Australia, in many ways, they can be great partners for ASEAN countries. And in the whole so-called conversation of ASEAN plus, dialogues, you do see the presence of Japan and South Korea in particular. So I would say, by partnering with countries like Japan and South Korea and Australia, these have shared interests will manifest themselves, and probably that would be an alternative or robust alternative supply chain model for a lot of the firms to consider.
Great. Oh, very interesting. Thank you for that. And then this question will be for Mike, and it's kind of flowing from your comment about the recent RAND publication about societal impact. How has the current political divide and dysfunction within the US, how has it affected its influence and credibility with the middle powers?
Not well. I mean, I think the challenge for the United States, of course, as we know, is that it's the latest of a whole series of events stretching back to, in some ways, some examples even before 9/11, but, 9/11, the war on terror, Iraq, the global financial crisis, the Trump era, and I think just as we can with the international economic situation, it's easy to take an unnuanced view and forget about many of the residual strengths and advantages of American society. But the twin trends of political partisan fragmentation in many different ways, structural and otherwise. I mean, there are now many, not only districts, but also states that are becoming locked in one political party or another in ways that mean that candidates simply don't have to appeal to as broad a sector of the population. All of the polling about how Americans view others, an increasing share of Americans view those in other parties or those who ideologically disagree with them as enemies, as opposed to just people they disagree with. And then the other major thing is this increasing role of disinformation, conspiracy theories, and so on that take root among some of these groups on either side of the political spectrum, and make it much more difficult to build consensus. So those are two things that to me are a little different than, we've had partisan debates in the last 30 to 50 years. And I think that a lot of other countries watching American politics get a sense that there is something more deeply wrong with the American political system and situation than there has been in the past. All the polling evidence, all the conversations I have, all the evidence that I see suggests that in most countries of what we're talking about as the global South, or even just outside the great powers involved in the competition, have an enormous hope that America recovers from this moment, because they see the best parts of American leadership as broadly benefiting the international community and their own prosperity and security. So that's the optimistic side, is that for the most part, I think there's a strong sense of rooting for the United States to become, to get back to being a more unified country capable of leadership. But I think that this whole series of events has very significantly shaken the sense that the United States is a predictable, reliable, legitimate power that can lead an international order. It has not yet become fatal, does not need to be, but another few events like that, and we'll be in a very different situation than we have been.
All right, thank you. So grim, unfortunately. Zoe, what major transformations could we see within the working mechanisms of the global financial institutions that are likely to remain in place after the Ukrainian crisis is resolved, if or whenever that might be?
Economists tend to be terrible at making forecasting or predictions, but I think I'm fairly confident to say that a lot of these alternative financial infrastructures that have already been being laid down, whether it is the Russian version of SWIFT or the Chinese version, Iran has their own version of SWIFT, right? I think a lot of these alternative payment frameworks would continue being there, not just because of the uncertainties in global geopolitical tensions, but also, just for pure practical economic reasons. As long as the dollar is the hegemonic or the dominant currency in global financial and trading system, other currencies would have to, make exchanges to convert into dollar in order to, make payment to their counterpart. Because when we are talking about international payment, international transactions, you need your counterpart to agree to take whatever currency that you are willing to give them. So as long as the US dollar is the most favored currency by any trading partners, there is going to be a currency risk for any countries that does not automatically print the US dollar, right? So from that perspective, being able to use an alternative payment system, not just ease the sanction risk or hedge against geopolitical risk, but also, in many ways facilitate the transaction in between countries directly, reducing the transaction cost. So from practical perspective, I think as long as the infrastructure is there, it's not going to go away. And then on the other hand, because of Russia, the sanctions on Russia is just so unprecedented, stringent, that it basically wake up a lot of other countries that are not necessarily on the good terms with the United States. So you've seen not just President Putin recently called on his BRIC partners to say, hey guys, we need to think about harmonizing our national payment system. And guess who is interested? Of course, China, India are interested, but Iran is also interested. And apart from Iran, who might also be interested, we are talking about a series of other revisionist countries, not that might not include North Korea, might to a certain extent include with Venezuela to a certain extent as well. So apart from these geopolitical rivalries, who else is discontent about the dollar's dominance and the US financial hegemonic power? Our EU partners are grumpy about that, and our British siblings, they are also grumpy about that. During I remember this reading the former Bank of England Governor Mark Carney's speech at the Jackson Hole conference, in 2019. He was literally talking about, how dangerous the US dollar's dominance currency is, the dollar's hegemonic power is. Hence, he demanded, our siblings are demanding a revision to the global system, and he was proposing, a basket of currencies, like an alternative system. But we are seeing this shared or convergence interest in revising the existing financial system dominated by the US dollar and the US leadership. But that does not necessarily mean the US cannot preserve its leadership. It's probably time for us to think about what have we been doing wrong, especially we are running a huge trade deficit, and we are having tremendous amount of pressures of inflation, and we do not seem to understand what we need to do next. So probably it's time to fix our own problems and then think about how to restore our leadership.
Great, thank you so much, Zoe. Mike, besides the fact, and this has been discussed and you've mentioned about the countries identifying and pursuing their own national interests, what, if anything, do they have in common?
You're talking about the so-called middle powers, you mean,
yes.
among them?
Yeah.
So just quickly, I know we're sort of getting to the end. I think, and Zoe was just hitting on it too with the United Kingdom. I think one thing that gets back to the issue that it's very difficult to sort of group these countries in just a big basket, because they have a lot of things, differences on all kinds of political and economic issues. One thing they have in common, I think, is a sense that the international system has been too US centric for too long, and it's time to readjust that dial a bit. But in what way, to what degree, very different views. So I think that, but even that statement, I mean, depending on the issue you're talking about, if you're talking about the US security situation in Asia, there are some middle powers in Asia who don't want to adjust the level of US dominance. So even that one, there's qualifications. But I think broadly speaking, if there's anything that they have in common, it's the desire to claim collectively a little bit more voice in how things are done.
Great. Thank you so much. So now I will pose the final question in the couple of minutes that we have remaining for both of you. What are some of the signs that you are looking for that middle powers are going in one direction or another? And I think here we're talking about whether it's more toward the world order under the United States leadership or more of a China-Russia potential axis. So let me start with you, Mike.
So just quickly, I'd say, I think some of the stuff Zoe was just talking about is a good clue in the sense that the things I would look to would be more economic and technological and maybe cultural rather than military. On the military side, you're going to see a lot of countries continue to align with the United States because it's in their align security-wise because it's in their interest. But I think in terms of financial networks, trade policy, joining the Huawei kinds of decisions, welcoming or not welcoming Chinese digital Silk Road infrastructure, welcoming Confucius Institutes, and not just with China, but also Russia and potentially Iran. A whole series of indicators that would give you a sense that these are countries that have decided increasingly over time that while they want to remain in a hedging position, broadly speaking, their fundamental economic, technological, and to some degree cultural relationships are going to be with China, to some degree Russia and others, as opposed to the United States and the West. Those would be the indicators that I would look for.
Thank you. And Zoe?
This is great. I mean, again, Michael, I think you are just speaking my language. Looking at financial infrastructure, the digital infrastructure. I do think that is the future to look at because you touched upon all the things that I really wanted to touch upon, and then I just wanted to probably just add a small footnote to the infrastructure aspect. On the one hand, we see hard infrastructure, port, highways, high-speed railways, and so on and so forth. But then there is also the financial payment infrastructure, and part of that I would want to pay more attention is to look at how government regulations are converging or diverging with regard to cryptocurrencies versus the central bank digital currencies, because that is talking about a totally alternative infrastructure that, on the one hand, if managed half-heartedly, or we do not do we don't do a good job monitoring the development, probably we are going to not just missing out, but fundamentally hurt our economic statecraft toolbox.
Great. Well, thank you so much. There were so many great questions, but unfortunately we've run out of time. I want to thank both Zoe and Mike for a fascinating discussion today and their invaluable insights about the role of the middle powers and what we might expect in the future. Just some brief housekeeping notes. We have an upcoming event on Tuesday, July 12th. It's our foreign affairs discussion group about Xi's gamble on Putin was doubling down a mistake. And that will be hosted by Dr. Una Alexandra Bergina Cherenkova. This is an opportunity for people to give their voice in the discussion. And finally, as a nonprofit, we would love to continue bringing these virtual briefings to the public for free. We hope that you might consider making a contribution to the network so that we can continue on with these wonderful discussions. So thank you again, everyone, and wishing you all a wonderful afternoon or evening, wherever you may be. Thank you.